Section 1 of The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. Cinderella's Slippers by Hugh C. Ware. Part 1. 1. Raymond Rennick might have been going to his wedding instead of to his death. Spick and span in a new spring suit, he paused just outside the broad-arched gates of the Duffield estate and drew his silver cigarette case from his pocket. A self-satisfied smile flashed across his face as he struck a match and inhaled the fragrant odor of the tobacco. It was good tobacco, very good tobacco, and Senator Duffield's private secretary was something of a judge. For a moment Rennick lingered. It was a day to banish uncomfortable thoughts, to smooth the rough edges of a man's problems and burdens. As the secretary glanced up at the soft blue sky, the reflection swept his mind that his own future was as free from clouds. It was a pleasing reflection. Perhaps the cigarette, perhaps the day helped to deepen it, as he swung almost jauntily up the winding driveway towards the square white house, commanding the terraced lawn beyond. Just ahead of him a maple tree, standing alone, rustled gaily in its spring foliage like a woman calling attention to her new finery. It was all so fresh and beautiful and innocent. Rennick felt a tingling thrill in his blood. Unconsciously he tossed away his cigarette. He reached the rustling maple and passed it. From behind the gnarled trunk a shadow darted. A figure sprang at his shoulders, with the long blade of a dagger awkwardly poised. There was a flash of steel in the sunlight. It was perhaps 10 minutes later that they found him. He had fallen face downward at the edge of the driveway, with his body half across the velvet green of the grass. A thin thread of red, creeping from the wound in his breast, was losing itself in the sod. One hand was doubled, as in a desperate effort at defence. His glasses were twisted under his shoulders. Death must have been nearly instantaneous. The dagger had reached his heart at the first thrust. One might have fancied an expression of overpowering amazement in the staring eyes. That was all. The weapon had caught him squarely on the left side. He had evidently whirled toward the assassin almost at the instant of the blow. Whether in the second left him of life he had recognized his assailant, and the recognition had made his death blow the quicker and the surer, were questions that only deepened the horror of the noonday crime. As though to emphasize the hour, the mahogany clock in Senator Duffield's library rang out its 12 monotonous chimes as John Dorrance, his valet, beat sharply on the door. The echo of the nervous tattoo was lost in an unanswering silence. Dorrance repeated his knock before he brought an impatient response from beyond the panels. "Can you come, sir?" The valet burst out. "Something awful has happened, sir. It's... The door was flung open. A ruddy-faced man with thick white hair and grizzled moustache, and the hints of a nervous temperament showing in his eyes and voice, sprang into the hall. Somebody once remarked that Senator Duffield was Mark Twain's double. The senator took the comparison as a compliment, perhaps because it was a woman who made it. Dorrance seized his master by the sleeve, which loss of dignity did more to impress the senator with the gravity of the situation than all of the servant's excitable words. "Mr. Rennick, sir, has been stabbed, sir, on the lawn, and Miss Beth, sir." Senator Duffield staggered against the wall. The valet's alarm swerved to another channel. "Shall I get the brandy, sir?" "Brandy?" the senator repeated vaguely. The next instant, as though grasping the situation anew, he sprang down the hall, with the skirts of his frock coat flapping against his knees. At the door of the veranda he whirled. "Get the doctor on the phone, Dorrance. Redfield, if Scott is out, let him know it's a matter of minutes. And, Dorrance—" "Yes, sir." "Tell the telephone girl that, if this leaks to the newspapers, I will have the whole office discharged." A shifting group on the edge of the lawn, with that strange sense of awkwardness which sudden death brings, showed the scene of the tragedy. The circle fell back as the senator's figure appeared. On the grass, Rennick's body still lay where it had fallen, suggesting a skater who has ignominiously collapsed on the ice rather than a man stabbed to the heart. The group had been wondering at the fact in whispered monosyllables. A kneeling girl was bending over the secretary's body. It was not until Senator Duffield had spoken her name twice that she glanced up. In her eyes was a grief so wild that for a moment he was held dumb. "Come, Beth," he said gently, "this is no place for you." At once the white-faced girl became the central figure of the situation. If she heard him, she gave no sign. The senator caught her shoulder and pushed her slowly away. One of the woman servants took her arm. Curiously enough, the two were the only members of the family that had been called to the scene. The senator swung on the group with a return of his aggressiveness. "Someone who can talk fast and to the point, tell me the story. Burke, you have a ready tongue. How did it happen?" The groom, a much-tanned young fellow in his early 20s, touched his cap. "I don't know, sir. No one knows. Mr. Rennick was lying here, stabbed, when we found him. He was already dead." "But surely there was some cry, some sound of a scuffle?" The groom shook his head. "If there was, sir, none of us heard it. We all liked Mr. Rennick, sir. I would have gone through fire and water if he needed my help. If there had been an outcry loud enough to reach the stable, I would have been there on the jump." "Do you mean to tell me that Rennick could have been struck down in the midst of 15 or 20 people with no one the wiser? It's ridiculous, impossible." Burke squared his shoulders with an almost unconscious suggestion of dignity. "I'm telling you the truth, sir." The senator's glance dropped to his secretary's body, and he looked up with a shudder. Then, as though with an effort, his eyes returned to the huddled form, and he stood staring down at the dead man, with a frown knitting his brow. Once he jerked his head toward the gardener with a curt question. "Who found him?" Jenkins shambled forward uneasily. "I did, sir. I hope you don't think I disturbed the body." The senator shrugged his shoulder impatiently. He did not raise his head again until the sound of a motor in the driveway woke the tension. The surgeon had arrived. Almost at the same time there was a cry from Jenkins. The gardener stood perhaps a half a dozen yards from the body, staring at an object hidden in the grass at his feet. He stooped and raised it. It was a woman's slipper. As a turn of his head showed him the eyes of the group turned in his direction, he walked across to Senator Duffield, holding his find at arm's length, as though its dainty outlines might conceal an added nest. The slipper was of black suede, high-heeled and slender, tied with a broad black ribbon. One end of the ribbon was broken and stained as though it had tripped its owner. On the thin sole were cakes of the peculiar red clay of the driveway. It might have been unconscious magnetism that caused the senator suddenly to turn his eyes in the direction of his daughter. She was swaying on the arm of the servant. Throwing off the support of the woman, she took 2 quick steps forward, with her hand flung out as though to tear the slipper from him. And then, without a word, she fell prone on the grass. 2. The telephone in my room must have been jangling a full moment before I struggled out of my sleep and raised myself to my elbow. It was with a feeling of distinct rebellion that I slipped into my kimono and slippers and shuffled across to the sputtering instrument in the corner. From 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening I had been on racking duty in the Farragut poison trial, and the belated report of the wrangling jury, at an hour which made any sort of meal impossible until after 10, had left me worn out physically and mentally. I glanced at my watch as I snapped the receiver to my ear. It lacked barely 15 minutes of midnight, an unearthly hour to call a woman out of bed, even if she is past the age of sentimental dreams. "Well?" I growled. A laugh answered me at the other end of the wire. I would have slung the receiver back to the hook and myself back to bed had I not recognized the tones. There is only one person in the world, excepting the tyrant at our city editor's desk, who would arouse me at midnight. But I had thought this person separated from me by 1,200 miles of ocean. Madeline Mack? I gasped. The laughter ceased. Madeline Mack it is, came back the answer, now reduced to a tone of decorous gravity. Pardon my merriment, Nora, the mental picture of your huddled form. But I thought you in Jamaica, I broke in, now thoroughly awake. I was, until Saturday. Our steamer came out of quarantine at 4 o'clock this afternoon. As it develops, I reached here at a psychological moment. I kicked a rocker to my side and dropped into it with a rueful glance at the rumpled sheets of the bed. With Madeline Mack at the telephone at midnight, only one conclusion was possible, and such a conclusion shattered all thoughts of sleep. Have you read the evening dispatches from Boston, Nora? I have read nothing, except the report of the Farragut jury, I returned crisply. Why? If you had, you would perhaps divine the reason of my call. I have been retained in the Rennick murder case. I am taking the 1:30 sleeper for Boston. I secured our berths just before I telephoned. Our berths? I am taking you with me. Now that you are up, you may as well dress and ring for a taxicab. I will meet you at the Roanoke Hotel. But, I protested, don't you think... Very well, if you don't care to go, that settles it. Oh, I will be there, I said with an air of resignation. 10 minutes to dress and 15 minutes for the taxi. I will add 5 minutes for incidentals, Madeline replied and hung up the receiver. The elevator boy at the Occident where I had my modest apartment had become accustomed to the strange hours and strange visitors of a newspaper woman during my 3 years' residence. He opened the door with a grin of sympathy as the car reached my floor. As though to give more active expression to his feelings, he caught up my bag and gave it a place of honor on his own stool. "Going far?" he queried as I alighted at the main corridor. I may be back in 24 hours, and I may not be back for 24 days, I answered cautiously. I knew Madeline Mack. As I waited for the whir of the taxicab, I appropriated the evening paper on the night clerk's desk. The Rennick murder case had been given a 3-column head on the front page. If I had not been so absorbed in the Farragut trial, it could not have escaped me. I had not finished the headlines, however, when the taxi, with a promptness almost uncanny, rumbled up to the curb. I threw myself back against the cushions, switched on the electric light, and spread my paper over my knee, as the chauffeur turned off towards Fifth Avenue. The story was well written and had made much of a few facts. Trust my newspaper instinct to know that. I had expected a fantastic puzzle, when it could spur Madeline into action within 6 hours after her landing, but I was hardly anticipating a problem such as I could read between rather than in the lines of type before me. Long before the Roanoke loomed into view, I had forgotten my lost sleep. The identity of Raymond Rennick's assassin was as baffling as in the first moments of the discovery of the tragedy. There had been no arrests, nor hint of any. From the moment when the secretary had turned into the gate of the Duffield yard until the finding of his body, all trace of his movements had been lost as effectually as though the darkness of midnight had enveloped him instead of the sunlight of moon. More than 10 minutes could not have elapsed between his entrance into the grounds and the discovery of his murder, perhaps not more than 5, but they had been sufficient for the assassin to effect a complete escape. There was not even the shadow of a motive. Raymond Rennick was one of those few men who seem to be without an enemy. In an official capacity, his conduct was without a blemish. In a social capacity, he was admittedly one of the most popular men in Brookline, among both sexes. Rumor had it, apparently on unquestioned authority, that the announcement of his engagement to Beth Duffield was to have been an event of the early summer. This fact was in my mind as I stared out into the darkness. On a sudden impulse I opened the paper again. From an inside page, the latest photograph of the senator's daughter, taken at a fashionable Boston studio, smiled up at me. It was an excellent likeness as I remembered her at the inaugural ball the year before, a wisp of a girl, with a mass of black hair, which served to emphasize her frailness. I studied the picture with a frown. There was a sense of familiarity in its outlines which certainly our casual meeting could not explain. Then, abruptly, my thoughts flashed back to the crowded courtroom of the afternoon, and I remembered. In the prisoner's dock I saw again the figure of Beatrice Farragut, slender, fragile, her white face, her sombre gown, her eyes fixed like those of a frightened lamb on the jury which was to give her life or death. She poisoned her husband, had Buster whispered comments at my shoulders during the weary weeks of the trial. She couldn't harm a butterfly. Like a mocking echo, the tones of the foreman had sounded the answering verdict of murder in the first degree. And in New York this meant... Why had Beatrice Farragut suggested Beth Duffield? Or was it Beth Duffield who had suggested... I crumpled the paper into a heap and tossed it from the window in disgust at my morbid imagination. Brr! And yet they say that a New York newspaper woman has no nerves. A voice hailed us from the darkness, and a white-gowned figure sprang out onto the walk. As the chauffeur brought the machine to a halt, Madeline Mack caught my hands. Her next two actions were thoroughly characteristic. Whirling to the driver, she demanded shortly, "How soon can you make the Grand Central Station?" The man hesitated. "Can you give me 20 minutes?" "Just. We will leave here at 1 sharp. You will wait, please." Having thus disposed of the chauffeur, Madeline never gave a thought to the matter of expense. She seized my arm and pushed me through the entrance of the Roanoke as nonchalantly as though we had parted 6 hours before instead of 6 weeks. "I hope you enjoyed Jamaica," I ventured. "Did you read the evening papers on the way over?" she returned as easily as though I had not spoken. "One," I answered shortly. Madeline's habit of ignoring my queries grated most uncomfortably at times. "Then you know what has been published concerning the case?" I nodded. "I imagine that you can add considerable." "As a matter of fact, I know less than the reporters." Madeline threw open the door of her room. "You have interviewed Senator Duffield on several occasions, have you not, Nora? You might say on several delicate occasions, if you cared to. You can tell me, then, whether the senator is in the habit of polishing his glasses when he is in a nervous mood." A rather superior smile flashed over my face. "I assure you that Senator Duffield never wears glasses on any occasion." Something like a chuckle came from Madeline. "Perhaps you can do as well on another question. You will observe in these newspapers 4 different photographs of the murdered secretary. Naturally, they bear many points of similarity. They were all taken in the last 3 years, but they contain one feature in common which puzzles me. Does it impress you in the same way?" I glanced at the group of photographs doubtfully. 3 of them were obviously newspaper snapshots, taken of the secretary while in the company of Senator Duffield. The 4th was a reproduction of a conventional cabinet photograph. They showed a clean-shaven, well-built young man of 30 or thereabouts, tall, and I should say inclined to athletics. I turned from the newspaper to Madeline with a shrug. "I'm afraid I don't quite follow you," I admitted ruefully. "There is nothing at all out of the ordinary in any of them that I can catch." Madeline carefully clipped the pictures and placed them under the front cover of her black morocco notebook. As she did so, a clock chimed the hour of 1. We both pushed back our chairs. As we stepped into the taxicab, Madeline tapped my arm. "I wonder if Raymond Rennick polished his glasses when he was nervous," she asked musingly. 3. Boston, from the viewpoint of the South Station, at 7:30 in the morning, suggested me a rheumatic individual climbing stiffly out of bed. Boston distinctly resents anything happening before noon. I'll wager that nearly every important event that she has contributed in history occurred after lunchtime. If Madeline Mack had expected to have to find her way to the Duffield home without a guide, she was pleasantly disappointed. No less a person than the senator himself was awaiting us at the train gate. A somewhat disheveled senator, it must be confessed, with the stubble of a day-old beard showing eloquently how his peace of mind and the routine of his habits had been shattered. As he shook hands with us, he made an obvious attempt to recover something of his ease of manner. "I trust that you had a pleasant night's rest," he ventured, as he led the way across the station to his automobile. "Much pleasanter than you had, I fear," replied Madeline. The senator sighed. "As a matter of fact, I found sleep hopeless. I spent most of the night with my cigar. The suggestion of meeting your train came as a really welcome relief." As we stepped into the waiting motor, a leather-lunged newsboy thrust a bundle of heavy typed papers into our faces. The senator whirled with a curt dismissal on his tongue, when Madeline thrust a coin towards the lad and swept a handful of flapping papers into her lap. "There is absolutely nothing new in the case, Miss Mac, I assure you," the senator said impatiently. "The reporters have pestered me like so many leeches. The sight of the headlines makes me shiver." Madeline bent over her papers without comment. As I settled into the seat by her side, however, and the machine whirred around the corner, I saw that she was not even making a pretense of reading. I watched her with a frown as she turned the pages. There was no question of her interest, but it was not the type that held her attention. I doubted if she was perusing a line of the closely set columns. It was not until she reached the last paper that I solved the mystery. It was the illustrations that she was studying. When she finished the heap of papers, she began slowly and even more thoughtfully to go through them again. Now I saw that she was pondering the various photographs of Senator Duffield's family that the newspapers had published. I turned away from her bent form and tapping finger, but there was a magnetism of her abstraction that forced my eyes back to her in spite of myself. As my gaze returned to her, she thrust her gloved hand into the recesses of her bag, and drew out her black morocco notebook. From its pages she selected the 4 newspaper pictures of the murdered secretary that she had offered me the night before. With a twinkle of satisfaction she grouped them about a large, black-bordered picture which stared up at her from the printed page in her lap. Our ride to the Duffield gate was not a long one. In fact, I was so absorbed by my furtive study of Madeline Mac that I was startled when the chauffeur slackened his speed, and I realized from a straightening of the senator's bent shoulders that we were nearing our destination. At the edge of the driveway, a quietly dressed man in a grey suit, who was strolling carelessly back and forth from the gate to the house, eyed us curiously as we passed, and touched his hat to the senator. I knew at once he was a detective. Trust a newspaper woman to spot a plain-clothes man, even if he has left his police uniform at home. Madeline did not look up, and the senator made no comment. As we stepped from the machine, a tall girl with severe, almost classical features and a profusion of nut-brown hair which fell away from her forehead without even the suggestion of a ripple, was awaiting us. "My daughter, Maria," Senator Duffield announced formally. Madeline stepped forward with extended hand. It was evident that Miss Duffield had intended only a brief nod. For an instant she hesitated, with a barely perceptible flush. Then her fingers dropped limply into Madeline Mac's palm. I chuckled inwardly at the ill grace with which she did it. "This must be a most trying occasion for you," Madeline said with a note of sympathy in her voice which made me stare. Effusiveness of any kind was so foreign to her nature that I frowned as we followed our host into the wide front drawing-room. As we entered by one door, a black-gowned, white-haired woman, evidently Mrs. Duffield, entered by the opposite door. In spite of the reserve of the society leader, whose sway might be said to extend to 3 cities, she darted an appealing glance at Madeline Mac that melted much of the newspaper cynicism with which I was prepared to greet her. Madeline crossed the room to her side and spoke a low sentence that I did not catch, as she took her hand. I found myself again wondering at her unwonted friendliness. She was obviously exerting herself to gain the good will of the Duffield household. Why? A trim maid, who stared at us as though we were museum freaks, conducted us to our rooms, adjoining apartments at the front of the 3rd floor. The identity of Madeline Mac had already been noised through the house, and I caught a saucer-eyed glance from a second servant as we passed down the corridor. If the atmosphere of suppressed curiosity was embarrassing my companion, however, she gave no sign of the fact. Indeed, we had hardly time to remove our hats when the breakfast gong rang. The family was assembling in the old-fashioned dining-room when we entered. In addition to the members of the domestic circle whom I had already indicated, my attention was at once caught by two figures who entered just before us. One was a young woman whom it did not need a second glance to tell me was Beth Duffield. Her white face and swollen eyes were evidence enough of her overwrought condition, and I caught myself speculating why she had left her room. Her companion was a tall, slender young fellow with just the faintest trace of a stoop in his shoulders. As he turned towards us, I saw a handsome, though self-indulgent face, to a close observer suggesting evidences of more dissipation than was good for its owner. And, if the newspaper stories of the doings of Fletcher Duffield were true, the facial index was a true one. If I remembered rightly, Senator Duffield's son more than once had made prim old Boston town rub her spectacled eyes at the tales of his escapades. Fletcher Duffield bowed rather abstractedly as he was presented to us, but during the eggs and chops he brightened visibly, and put several curious questions to Madeline as to her methods of work, which enlivened what otherwise would have been a rather dull half-hour. As the strokes of 9 rang through the room, my companion pushed her chair back. "What time is the coroner's inquest, Senator?" Mr. Duffield raised his eyebrows at a change in her attitude. "It is scheduled for 11 o'clock." "And when do you expect Inspector Taylor of headquarters?" "In the course of an hour, I should say, perhaps less. His man, Martin, has been here since yesterday afternoon. You probably saw him as we drove into the yard. I can telephone Mr. Taylor if you wish to see him sooner." "That will hardly be necessary, thank you." Madeline walked across to the window. For a moment she stood peering out on the lawn. Then she stopped, and her hand fumbled with the catch. The window swung open with the noiselessness of well-oiled hinges, and she stepped out onto the veranda, without so much as a glance at the group about the table. I think the Senator and I rose from our chairs at the same instant. When we reached the window, Madeline was half across the lawn. Perhaps 20 yards ahead of her towered a huge maple rustling in the early morning breeze. I realized that this was the spot where Raymond Rennick had met his death. In spite of his nervousness, Senator Duffield did not forget his old-fashioned courtliness, which I believe had become second nature to him. Stepping aside with a slight bow, he held the window open for me, following at my shoulder. As we reached the lawn, I saw that the scene of the murder was in plain view from at least one of the principal rooms of the Duffield home. Madeline was leaning against the maple when we reached her. Senator Duffield said gravely, as he pointed to the gnarled trunk, "You are standing just at the point where the woman waited, Miss Mack." "Woman?" "I refer to the assassin," the Senator rejoined a trifle impatiently. "Judging by our fragmentary clues, she must have been hidden behind the trunk when poor Rennick appeared on the driveway. We found her slippers somewhat to the left of the tree, a matter of 8 or 10 feet, I should say." "Oh!" said Madeline listlessly. I fancied that she was somewhat annoyed that we had followed her. "An odd clue, that slipper," the Senator continued with an obvious attempt to maintain the conversation. "If we were disposed to be fanciful, it might suggest the childhood legend of Cinderella." Madeline did not answer. She stood leaning back against the tree with her eyes wandering about the yard. Once I saw her gaze flash down the driveway to the open gate, where the detective, Martin, stood watching us furtively. "Nora," she said without turning, "will you kindly walk 6 steps to your right?" I knew better than to ask the reason for the request. With a shrug, I faced toward the house, and came to a pause at the end of the stipulated distance. "Is Miss Norriker standing where Mr. Rennick's body was found, Senator?" "She will strike the exact spot, I think, if she takes 2 steps more." I had hardly obeyed the suggestion when I caught a swift rustle of skirts behind me. I whirled to see Madeline's lithe form darting towards me with the right hand raised, as though it held a weapon. "Good!" she cried. "I call you to witness, Senator, that I was fully 6 feet away when she turned. Now, I want you to take Miss Norriker's place. The instant you hear me behind you, the instant, mind you, I want you to let me know." She walked back to the tree, as the Senator reluctantly changed places with me. I could almost picture the murderess dashing upon her victim as Madeline bent forward. The Senator turned his back to us with a rather ludicrous air of bewilderment. My erratic friend had covered perhaps half of the distance between her and our host when he spun about with a cry of discovery. She paused with a long breath. "Thank you, Senator. What first attracted your attention to me?" "The rustle of your dress, of course." Madeline turned to me with the first smile of satisfaction I had seen since we entered the Duffield gate. "Was the same true in your case, Nora?" I nodded. "The fact that you are a woman hopelessly betrayed you, if you had not been hampered by petticoats." Madeline broke in upon my sentence with that peculiar freedom which she always reserves to herself. "There are 2 things I would like to ask of you, Senator, if I may." "I am at your disposal, I assure you." "I would like to borrow a Boston directory and the services of a messenger." We walked slowly up the driveway, Madeline again relapsing into her preoccupied silence, and Senator Duffield making no effort to induce her to speak. End of Cinderella's Slippers by Hugh C. Ware, Part 1. Recording by Christine G. in Oslo, Norway. The 24th of September, 2012.